Hello, and thanks for joining us for our webinar, MITRE Attack for ICS, Practical Considerations. My name is Jack Marcel. I'll be the moderator for today's event. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we begin. All lines have been muted for the duration of today's call, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from you, so feel free to ask questions using the questions feature in BrightTalk. We'll take some time at the end of this call to get to your answers. And if we don't get to everyone, or if we run out of time, we will be sure to follow up with you later. So now I'd like to welcome today's speakers. Otis Alexander is the lead cybersecurity engineer at the MITRE Corporation. He's going to describe how the new attack for ICS knowledge base compares and contrasts with their previously published knowledge bases, MITRE Attack for Enterprise. Nadir Israel, CTO and co-founder at ARMIS, will dive deep on practical applications and tips that ARMIS has recently published regarding cyber defenses for industrial control systems. And Fritz Wetschnig, Chief Information Security Officer at Flex, a global manufacturing organization, will describe how his security team is currently using the MITRE Attack knowledge base to optimize their cyber defenses. So now, Otis Alexander, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Jack. So for those who aren't familiar with MITRE, I like to just give an introduction. So MITRE is a not-for-profit corporation. We work through private-public partnerships and with federal R&D centers to drive innovation in critical infrastructure, including industrial control systems. So our mission is solving problems for a safer world, and industrial control security really falls within that purview. At MITRE, we pride ourselves on our objectivity, and we try to be a trusted third party to the entities that we work with, and we work in the public's interest. So today I'll be talking about Attack for ICS. I'll be giving a little introduction into Attack and kind of why we moved into the industrial control system realm, and then some practical applications. But I wanted to let you guys know that Attack for ICS is publicly available to everybody, so I encourage you to go to attack.mitre.org/ICS to see it. There's also a Medium blog post link here that talks about some of the common questions people have. So if you have some questions, maybe take a look there and see if they're answered, and then reach out if there's something that you still have questions about. So, intro to Attack. For people who aren't familiar with Attack or new to Attack, I'll just go over some of the basic concepts. So first, what is Attack? Well, it's a knowledge base of adversary behavior. And this knowledge base isn't going to cover every single thing that somebody could do to a system. It's based on real-world observations. This includes what happens in the wild. It includes what credible red teamers or researchers are looking at, things like that. So another thing to consider is it's free, open, and globally accessible. So if you go to attack.mitre.org, you'll see all of our technique matrices. You'll see the different technology domains, but the point here is it's free and available to you. And then it serves as a common language or a common lexicon. So if you're running red team, blue team exercises, you can use it to communicate back and forth between the teams to work together more efficiently. And also, if you need to relay information about how well you're doing to leadership, you can use it as well. And then lastly, I think most importantly, is community-driven. So we're not just doing this on our own at MITRE. We solicit community feedback. We want contributions from you. So always feel free to reach out and let us know if you're seeing new techniques or if you have any feedback about the knowledge base. So this is the technique matrix. It's a representation of the content and Attack. This particular matrix is for Attack for ICS. Let's break it down really quick. So across the top, you have tactics, and these are the adversary's technical goals, what they're actually trying to accomplish. So this may be initial access into the system, all the way to impairing process control. Associated with these tactics are techniques, and these techniques really tell the story about how the adversary can accomplish these high-level tactical goals. If you look at the technique matrix, some techniques are associated with multiple tactic columns, but each one is associated with the tactic. And then if you look within a specific technique, you'll see a specific technique implementation. This really gives the details on how an adversary used a technique to accomplish their goal. So altogether, this represents tactics, techniques, and procedures, or what you hear people talk about as TTPs, and these represent adversary behavior. So if you look on attack.mitre.org, you'll see a number of technology domains. You'll see enterprise, you'll see mobile, and you'll see ICS. So why did we create a new knowledge base for ICS? Why couldn't enterprise or something handle it? Well, there's a number of key differences that we have to take in consideration. Attacker goals may be different. If you're familiar with industrial control systems attacks, it usually has something to do with affecting the industrial process negatively, affecting availability, damaging property, or something like that. Also, the underlying systems are different. So we can't just say, hey, we're going to look at Windows and Linux systems only. We have to look at other embedded OSs or firmware and specialized systems. And then the defenses are different. So we really have to take some things into consideration when we recommend the defenses for these areas. One is how do we get data sources? A lot of times there's no agents to go on embedded systems. So how do we extract data sources from hosts, or what data sources are important to us within this environment? How do we monitor the environment? How is it different from a traditional enterprise network? And then also in terms of if we have an incident or we're trying to mitigate against the incident, how do we do that in a safe way that it goes along with our goals of an industrial control system? There's a lot of things that we have to take into consideration, and because of these differences, we created a new knowledge base to represent industrial control systems. So this here is the Purdue reference architecture, very popular in the OT community for explaining the functional levels of an industrial control system or just the asset owner and operator's environment in general. What this highlights is both attack models are useful because you have elements of IT or traditional enterprise systems within these environments, and you also have operational technology. So you kind of have to tell the whole story with a lot of these attacks. So when we get an incident, what we do is first we look at the entry point, and if it makes sense, we first break it down in terms of the enterprise attack knowledge base. We see what the adversary used in terms of techniques within that knowledge base. That usually gets us down into the supervisory control level, area control level, and then we don't have the techniques that we need or the tactics we need to explain the adversary behavior. And that's really where Attack for ICS comes into play. And using both of these knowledge bases together, we're able to tell the full story of what an adversary is doing from entry point all the way to an impact against the industrial control system. So this is the technique matrix for Attack for ICS again. We've already kind of broken it out into the key elements, the tactics, techniques, and procedures, but let's look a little deeper. So from initial access into command and control, we really get an idea of what the adversary is trying to do in terms of finding their targets, collecting information, and ultimately staging an attack. Hopefully, we have enough sensing in place, enough mitigations in place to stop them before they get in, but somewhere in these tactics before they're able to affect the system. Then as we move down, we get into inhibit response function. and impair process control. And this is really the adversary directly affecting the control systems or the different protections you have in place, such as protection systems or safety instrument systems or quality assurance systems that would prevent some catastrophic events from happening. And then lastly, we have impact, and this is what the adversary really seeks to create or do to the system. And it could be damaging property, as we mentioned before. It could be causing a loss of control situation, or just a general loss of availability. But you can kind of break down the tactics and the techniques in this way to better understand what the adversary is trying to accomplish. So that's all well and good. We understand the elements of attack for ICS and the general structure. How do we use it? So there's a number of ways that we can use attack for ICS. I'll quickly go over 3. So one of the ways that we can use is we can map incidents to it. So this is a mapping of Trident as it's represented in attack for ICS. But you may see something in your environment that the whole world's not privy to. So you can map against attack for ICS what you see in your environment and kind of get information about how other people have detected that behavior or mitigated that behavior by looking at the references or looking at the mitigations that are associated with certain techniques. So that's one way you can use it. You can also use this for information sharing. So if you broke down a particular incident, you can share that information with one of your partners. It could be another utility, it could be a security vendor or something like that, and you can get information regarding whether or not they've seen some similar behavior or what they would do in that situation. So mapping incidents really helps with that type of information sharing. So if you're feeling generous and you want to contribute and you don't see certain techniques represented, that's also something that you can do. So if you see a technique, you can always send that over to us with the relevant information, and we can evaluate it and include it in a way that protects your sensitive information, but also gets that information out to the broader community. And just in general, this exercise is good for just understanding adversary behavior in general. So another thing that you can do is adversary emulation. Adversary emulation is essentially threat-based red teaming. And it's thinking about what techniques are most likely to affect your environment and coming up with an implementation of the technique to run in somewhere safe, a non-production environment, so you can get a better idea of what that behavior looks like in your environment, what data sources you need to use to collect, to detect that behavior, and what analytics you may need to put into place. It's a good exercise for red teams and blue teams to go through, just in general to understand your defenses and see how well you're doing. And with that, you also can do a sort of heat map. So this just represents us understanding how confident we are that we could detect or mitigate certain things in our network. So we can use this at the end of the exercise to relay how well we've done in adversary emulation. We can use this to assess a SOC to understand how well a SOC is able to detect certain behaviors in the network. And we can also use it in a more passive sense. We could use it to do a tabletop exercise and see how well we could do in our real environment just by talking to people. So there's a lot of uses for this, and it can help us better understand our defenses and relay that knowledge to red team or blue teamers or actual leadership to get money to improve our defenses. So that was very quick, just going over attack for ICS and some of the ways that we use it. If you have more questions, feel free to ask them here, but also reach out to my email or social media. And now I'll pass it over to Nadir.
Thanks, Otis. And welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. What I'll do from the ARMIS side is share a few stories and share a few common ICS attack techniques, and specifically take you through practical measures of how to protect against these things, all based off of our experience and based off of our experience with the MITRE attack framework specifically. So without further ado, I'll just walk you guys through the matrix of the attack framework for ICS. We're going to focus in on two specific attacks for explanation for the sake of example here. One is internet accessible devices, and one is change program state. Both very popular techniques and potentially very risky and destructive. So as we go through it, what we'll describe for each of these is what is exactly this technique, how it manifests in a typical network, and what are some practical measures you can take against them. So starting with the first one, internet accessible devices. Like the name suggests, essentially one of the internal devices in one of the internal layers of the Purdue model is exposed to the internet. This can happen for a few different reasons. Primarily, what we see is configuration errors, and we'll kind of highlight some of these, unknown loopholes in different security architecture elements, as well as network infrastructure elements. And finally, we'll touch on Shodan.io and see just how easy it is to find these kinds of things. Purdue model in general, outer layers tend to be more exposed and specifically more IT-oriented. Internal OT layer should be segmented well, and most of these devices aren't really designed to connect to the internet anyway. In the common cases of what we see as internet accessible devices, the most common one is firewall configuration problems or issues. For the most part, because of external vendor access that's required to internal elements of the network for support. So third-party vendors basically get access punched through the firewall to whatever devices they need to access remotely, and the firewall configuration might be too permissive. There might be other loopholes that exist because of overlapping security measures, lots of different reasons for that. The good and bad news is that Shodan, in case no one knows the tool, is an excellent way of both understanding the exposure of your environment as well as an attacker's dream tool. Shodan, in a nutshell, is a search engine for devices. It's open, it's free. It allows to scan and find all devices that are open on the internet, find what they are, find their different vulnerabilities and configuration problems, and there's even an easy button for industrial control devices and their relevant protocols. Clicking on that in Shodan will bring you straight into which protocols, which vendors you want to target, and what devices exist for each of these across the entire internet. This is how easy it is to find internet accessible devices, and trust me, there are many of these. So going back to that model we mentioned before, the other thing to keep in mind is vulnerabilities. It's not just about how accessible devices are, it's about what vulnerabilities apply to them and the ability to basically use these vulnerabilities to circumvent any remaining security measures that might be in place. Case in point, Urgent 11. Urgent 11 is research done by ARMIS. It's a set of 11 critical vulnerabilities that allow remote takeover of industrial devices as well as others because of vulnerabilities that exist in the network stack of their underlying firmware. Rockwell, Siemens, Schneider Electric are all affected by these, or rather certain firmware versions of them are. And these are extremely prevalent devices. Think anything from PLCs to robotic controllers to lots of other pieces of equipment that exist within an industrial environment. And Urgent 11 is basically an over-the-wire or kind of over-the-network vulnerability that can be used in the TCP stack. Bringing these two back together, what we get is the ability to essentially take over internal devices and manipulate them from the internet. Finding them is easy using something like Shodan, and taking them over or compromising them is easy with well-known and published vulnerabilities such as the one that we showed. So practical defenses around this. First and foremost, strong asset inventory. This cannot be overstressed. Know what you have so that you know what you can protect. In most industrial environments, this is the first problem that exists there. While there are great engineering printouts of everything that exists on the OT side, there's usually a lack of understanding of how these devices are network connected. There's also a gap in understanding what other devices exist within that environment, especially on the IT side. So understanding what you have, understanding what's running on your network is step number one in being able to secure the environment. Obviously, step number two is being able to monitor connections, specifically being able to monitor anything coming through the network and anything coming from outside the network. When you look at a typical connectivity pattern within an industrial environment, you usually have the expected connections, SCADA servers to PLCs, HMIs to PLCs, and pretty much everything that exists within this diagram. Anything outside of this would be considered anomalous, but you have to understand what's normal in that environment to be able to actually understand what's anomalous. And finally, being aware of vulnerabilities from a risk standpoint is, of course, just as important. Not just understanding what's connecting to what, but understanding what vulnerabilities might be used to traverse one device to another, what vulnerabilities might be used from an exposure standpoint outside of the internet or in general, and being able to account for all these vulnerabilities, being able to manage them, being able to understand what's patched and what's relevant is a crucial part of closing that risk element. A risk assessment like this for ICS devices is something that you normally see within ARMIS, but within generally in the environment is what you should be tracking. It's not just about the vulnerabilities themselves. It's about ICS cert security advisories, DHS. There are any number of agencies that put out bulletins all the time. Being able to apply these to the environment, being able to understand what are the riskiest devices and being able to prioritize them is key in securing a large distributed manufacturing environment. Last but not least, when all else fails, being able to automatically detect and respond to threats, being able to understand what's connecting, being able to understand if it's anomalous, and being able to shut it down as a response is crucial in securing an environment. The practicality of this, and the reason it's not trivial, is because lots of these different devices have very specific protocols they use. Lots of them are operationally imperative to the business, and you wouldn't shut them down under any other circumstances. So having a strong detection and response mechanism is really important in securing the environment. A quick example of this, in this case from ARMIS, of course, is being able to track Shodan scans. So closing the loop on the Shodan, as we mentioned before, ARMIS can very effectively track, in this case, the Shodan scans themselves. This achieves two goals at once. One, the ability to detect and respond to any connections coming from outside the internet to any industrial device within. But two, being able to understand what are those internet-exposed devices by just tracking the Shodan scans themselves. Lots of our clients and lots of organizations in general use this as a metric to understand what exactly is exposed on their network from any degree. So now that we've covered internet accessible devices, the second technique we'll dive into is change program state. Now these two together form an extremely powerful tactic for attackers. And an understanding of both would lend you a great understanding of all the other techniques as well. So what exactly is change program state? If you look again at the Purdue model, in this case, let's imagine where attackers might be attacking the network or attacking devices from. It might be from the IT layer, a very, very common situation. The IT layer of most of these environments is the most vulnerable piece in the puzzle. So extremely popular to see an attacker gain a foothold on the IT side of things and then traverse into the OT side. But also things might happen at the engineering workstation level or in general at the layer 2 of this model. From the engineering workstations or from any foothold within the OT network, changes can be made to the industrial controllers themselves or the PLCs and through them to the equipment itself. Specifically, what we would be looking for and what the technique involves is either going outside of the normal loop of starting and stopping and resetting different devices or changing modes and changing programming of them. So essentially what we'd be looking for is an attacker stopping the current programming, changing the program, and then running something else. Typical examples of attacks like these that have happened, Stuxnet and Triton. In both of these cases, highly destructive results. Some of them targeted, some of them less so. But in general, the same method was applied in both. Taking over an engineering workstation and changing the programming on particular PLCs. So what are some practical defenses that can be taken into account here? First and foremost, limiting access. Being able to either segment or limit at the perimeter what access can happen to particular devices. This is the most basic form of defense, obviously, but it's also a highly effective one. Ultimately, limiting where a foothold situation might happen and where that foothold might impact the general network is key. The second thing, as before, is monitoring connections, and except in this case, it's monitoring them with context. Monitoring connections in this particular case would involve monitoring what traverses between different layers of this Purdue model. So if we take into account a graphics visualization of such connections, what we'd be looking for is situations where devices who have never communicated with a particular PLC before suddenly are, or multi-layer traversal of communications, meaning not things that traverse between nearby or adjacent layers, but things that traverse multiple layers at once, and connections that just shouldn't be happening at that level between different devices. Finally, context is everything here. Understanding the particular PLC commands, understanding the context of such PLC commands is exceptionally important in this case because we're trying to differentiate between an attacker and normal operation of PLCs. Even if an engineering workstation, which is a normal engineering workstation, gets taken over, we want to listen to abnormal commands and abnormal actions taken by that workstation in the context of the PLCs themselves. So it's not just about what are the ports and protocols being used or general metrics and metadata of network movement. It's also about the particular commands that are being used, the particular values that are being projected. Are they in range of what they should be? Are they something else? And specifically, being able to make sense out of this and make sense out of anomalies that get generated by them. Last but not least, again, being able to detect and respond automatically to different threats, being able to take action when things happen and take action immediately. Time and time again in real world attacks, we've seen that no matter what the traversal, what the entry point into the network is, or what foothold was created, attackers, once they gain a foothold within the network, then start projecting commands that could immediately cause destructive action. So being able to detect and respond immediately, being able to cut off access, be it through the command and control channel or being through the actual commands that are being sent, is key. In this case, detection of live attacks, as well as being able to take action either by quarantining, shutting off at the perimeter, doing a bunch of different actions that might compromise the operational integrity of the environment itself, but doing so in a smart way, doing so with the context of what the devices are themselves. So there are devices out there that are okay to quarantine. There are devices out there that are not okay to quarantine. There are lots of other measures that can take place. As I mentioned, cutting off the command and control channel, cutting off things at the perimeter are all things that should be available as tool sets to the team responding and being able to cut down the time to respond to either seconds or minutes or performing an actual automated response in the case where nothing happens. In general, there are lots of different practical measures that ARMIS research puts in place. You can look at our general blog section for other ideas and for other things that we haven't covered in this webinar. And with that, passing on the baton here to Fritz.
All right. So, hello, everyone, and I'm the CISO from Flex. And I give you some practical consideration how we are actually using the MITRE attack in our day-to-day life and what you need to think, not just technical, but also from an organization standpoint and from a business continuity or from a business relevance to that. Moving forward, I give you a quick overview about Flex. Flex is an electronic manufacturing company with around 26 billion revenue. A Fortune 500 company. We have around 160,000 employees and 130 facilities around the globe. And I'm the global CISO from that. from the company. So how are we using MITRE and why we are using MITRE? We actually started a little bit different when we implemented, because we are using it for 3 different things. First of all is detection analytics, to understand, not just to simulate, but also taking attacks, what we are seeing, and then map it to the MITRE attack framework, and to see, okay, what kind of things has been used and what our defense controls framework for that, right? And are they efficient enough, or why did the attack has been successful? How we actually what can we do to actually change that? Then also measuring the defense. And there's 2 things about that, is the efficiency of the controls, but also if you think about the multi-layer defense strategy, right? We all know not every tool is actually is 100% or it will never be. That could be because of technology, but that also a lot of times is a configuration. So we want to see if you move, for example, to one stage from another stage, at some point when you detect it and when you stop the attack. And can we move the needle more on the left side, where we say we stopped the attack earlier, or we detected it earlier and then stop it earlier. Then also, what we also bring in is when we do evaluation of new tools or new technology, when we identify gaps and say, okay, are these tools or whatever technology we're using, how efficient they are, right? How much they are going to close the gap, how much they're actually going to disrupt the technology or the attacks, or make it even, think about that from a perspective, make it more difficult for the attackers to be successful, right? At some point, the effort they have to perform the attack might be outnumber the financial gains they have. The one difference is, I think we start from a difference, and I do this with my team, is the impact. So we don't start with initial access or what kind of advisories. So we actually start with the impact. And the reason why I think this is important for us is because so we have different business units, we have different business segments. Not everything is the same, especially we are not critical infrastructure. So we might have a different impact. So our impact usually is loss of productivity and revenue, right? Or it could be loss of safety. So what is the attacker actually wants to achieve when he's going after us? And I think that's an important question to ask, because you don't start from the technical advisory side. You start, okay, what is the assets they're going to attack? What kind of assets we are going to discuss about it, right? What is my defense layer strategy or defense framework or control framework should actually prevent that the hacker would be successful and can do either damage to property or to different things, right? So, and then we use the framework also to map the controls and say, okay, the lateral movements, right? We take out from ICS default credentials. So how successful can you do P, right? What is our controls to prevent that, right? I mean, you might have operational procedures telling your folks to change default credentials. However, can you measure that? Can you scan it? Can you figure it out? Because the environment usually is dynamic or maybe not so dynamic. It's really depending on the company is. So constant monitoring is very important. We had the slides where we said asset inventory, right? We all know how difficult that is, because scanning, for example, gives you a snapshot at a certain time. How you constant monitoring which assets being connected to the IP? That could be also the converging of the ICS network, because maybe the connection is only made to certain times. Consider organizational-wise, ICS networks usually not controlled by IT, so you have also the organizational impact you need to consider. Does your defense framework support, or your response support, the different organization involved in that, right? So you have to tell the practical considerations you have to do. Then also what we're using is hunt for new threats. So if someone is publishing a threat vector, right, let's take it to us and say, okay, what they did go afterwards, and then what kind of techniques they used, and how would we detect that, right? Is our control sufficient enough? Would this be even a target would we even a target for this kind of attacks? And then also what we use is for general analytics is like we use the pen testing and say, hey, let's map how the pen testers maybe was able to achieve their goals and map the MITRE and say, hey guys, where we failed, right? Where was the detection failed? Where was the prevention failed? So these are the things you have to consider from the practical standpoint. I think for us, the difference is we start with the impact. And the reason why we do this, I show on the next slide, is if you take a typical manufacturing shop floor like this one, it's a mix. It can be a mix actually of IT and ICS network, right? So the reason why we started with the impact is because I start usually with think about my business process, think about actually how is this built up, right? There's different technology used here to actually get from a raw material to a finished product. So how are you mapping that? And if you take, for example, here, devices 6 and 7, which are a screen printer and component placement, they are usually running on a Windows operating system. But this devices are investments you make maybe for 10, 15 years. So your asset management has to consider the financial impact, because the ROI of those devices is for a longer period, as you usually in an IT environment, right? Our computers or servers is between 3 to 5 years, right? And this is shortened or even more and more as more dynamic we get. However, if you move the robot cell and maybe even to a collaborative robot, this is an ICS network, right? It has control. It might be connected, it might be not connected. It's depending on if this is a new RoboCell, if this is an old RoboCell. The only difference these days now is we want to have data out of these devices, right? Why? Because you want to measure product quality, you want to do different measurements, you want to improve your efficiency of the whole production line. So now you have this converge of two things. Now you need to use what you're using then is the MITRE factor is and say, hey, there's the enterprise, right? So if you compromise one of these devices, which is maybe regarding attack from an enterprise vector, but then you have a lateral movement, like default credential, for example, could be used that the RoboCell is using some weak or some default credential, and then you move over to an ICS network, and then you have the full control to a network. So how is the mitigation strategy? What could we achieve? What things we need to do? And those kind of things is the consideration, how my team is considering on using the MITRE impact. I think it's very important that you consider that instead of looking just from a technical perspective, because if you go like initial access, execution, persistence, and use the advisories, right, it doesn't really tell you the full story, because it doesn't tell you how your process looks like, right? How does it look like for you? How is your business have implemented certain controls? And our ICS network is maybe limited, as we have a lot of testers which running on enterprise systems, but also embedded systems is a very interesting. So considering like you have to think about firmware updates, right? ICS networks are different from that, right? How you create there is no automation on firmwares on ICS network, right? So it's more complicated. There might be tools you invested 15 years ago, you're not going to change that. So the reality is also those devices running maybe an old operating system or a very strange operating system. We have proprietary systems on certain devices you never heard about, that they are developed for just one purpose, and this is the purpose of the vendors, right? And then you also have to consider, we talked about that, right? How you get access to a third party. Maybe there are third parties actually not getting access to in this case, maybe to different testers within this manufacturing floor. And then he can, if he's compromised, the attackers might move on to the ICS network, right? So that's a consideration. That's the reason why we're not going just from a technical perspective, but also from a business perspective on this one. And give you and that's where I believe this is an OT, IoT converge or whatever. So I think what we're seeing is this converging from IT system and OT system together, right? There is no separation in terms of if this is just a control network and this is just your IT system. So this is a challenge for us as a security teams usually, because the security teams are usually very focused on the IP network and not on an IoT network. So this conversion, I think it's an organization challenge. And then also you need to start mapping both things, right? You don't go and just map and say, hey, this attack is just for my ICS network, right? No, think about what your ICS network is mapping over to the IT network, and then use both frameworks actually to understand, like, okay, internet accessible devices, right? Maybe your IT, maybe it's not the ICS network is internet accessible, but is your ICS network maybe on an internal network accessible, right? So if you compromise one device on your floor, would that actually be also give you like kind of accessibility from outside to your ICS network, right? How you control that, firewall configuration we talked about, but there's many things, right? You think about it. Also, I want to mention is like a lot of these ICS systems have, as the asset management is considered for a long, or the asset life cycle is considered for a long time, right? Maybe 10, 15, 20 years. The protocols implemented there may be not secure. You might need to deal with telnet. You might need to deal with very unsecure protocols, right? That you gain access to it. So how will you also then collecting information, like how we get logs out of the ICS network, like authentication logs, if possible. It's not every time it's possible, right? How you collect this one, how you put this in your SOC, or maybe you have a dedicated ICS SOC team as well, right? So that's depending on your environment. So how you build an environment where you can consider that, and that's how we actually using this to improve our cybersecurity defense in the manufacturing floor, as we use the MITRE framework actually to figure out, okay, internet accessible. So what is the initial access? Where you can execute, and what actually we want to achieve. And interesting thing is what we learned also on the firmware is supply, or let's start with two things I want to pick out, like supply chain compromise, as we have, as you saw, 16,000 suppliers. Supply chain compromise is a very, it's getting more and more critical, but also it's a very hard environment to control. So how you actually ensure that your supply chain is not compromised, right? And there's a lot of limitations regarding this one. It can start with things like you use a trusted broker to procure your devices. You might do some initial checks, but the question is how far you can go on those checks, right? And also I want to remind everyone there was the attack NotBadger, which was a signed firmware actually deployed for using attack, right? So, so now you need to consider how you do firmware updates on the ICS network as well. So what kind of things you can do, because ICS, its production is actually critical operations. And those testers, you can't simulate firmwares, right? Because I don't have a second device where I can test it and say, yes, the batch will not cause any issue. So these are the practical consideration we're getting out of the map as we use the MITRE attack vector to understand, okay, there's the technical things, but how are we going to build our defense layers on this technical roads, right, or framework. And that's it. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you very much, Fritz, Nadir, and Otis. It's now time for questions. To our live audience, if you have any questions, please enter them into BrightTalk so our presenters can answer them. We already have a number of questions. I see the first question is for Otis. Question is, how often will MITRE attack frameworks be updated with new threat information?
Yeah, so the new threat information is a little tricky. It's based on what makes it open source, essentially, or what people want to share. So I can't give you an exact time frame on that or anything like that, but what we were thinking internally is every 6 months we would release what we found in that time period. There's not a ton of attacks that are happening on ICS systems all the time, so it's a little different than the other technology domains. But we're thinking probably 6 months will be sufficient for updating Intel.
All right, thank you. Next one also for Otis. In your view, how would you like to see both security providers like ARMIS and customers like Flex use the MITRE ATT&CK framework?
Yeah, so for security providers, I think one big thing that we like to see is that alerts mention something or tie back to the Attack for ICS knowledge base. So if the alert pops up, a customer would be able to understand that this maps or ties to this particular tactic and technique. And if they wanted to get more information, they could look at the technique to understand how adversaries may have historically used the technique. Also, in reporting out to customers about incidents or anything like that, if you have a threat intel portal, anything similar, use Attack for ICS to kind of talk about adversary behavior. So use the tactics and techniques to better describe what the adversary is doing. So that's a couple of things. With actual customers or asset owners and operators or anything like that, I think some of the concerns are a little different. So one thing is with information sharing between customers or to ISACs and the like, we would like to see that they report using tactics and techniques from Attack for ICS. And then also, as we mature the mitigations and detections, we would want to see customers use those.
Okay, thank you. Next question is for Nadir. In your experience, are the ICS environments that you today? Is there something more prepared for?
So, yeah, this is a wonderful question because ultimately I think most ICS environments in the world, as we know, are fairly old. They weren't really designed to be network connected the way that they are. Digital transformation and lots of other reasons are driving this right now, or kind of IT-OT convergence. But in reality, most ICS environments are absolutely not as secure as they should be. I do think that the trend is definitely positive. I think that wide-scale attacks like WannaCry and NotPetya brought people to the understanding that even call it not as targeted industries like food and beverage, for instance, still require defenses because they might be collateral damage or casualties of other attacks, as well as attackers understanding that OT infrastructures, utilities, power, things like that are exceptionally vulnerable and very, very risky to the nations in question. So I think trending up, but most ICS environments today are not nearly as secure as they should be. And it starts with basically step number one for visibility. I think that most of these environments aren't really well understood or mapped out. In most cases, it's very hard to get even basic things like inventory or what vulnerabilities apply. And in general, yeah, I think we're all kind of trending to the right place, but not quite there yet.
Thank you. The questions are rolling in. We have a large number of participants today, and please do ask your question, because if we can't get to all of them, we will be sure to follow up afterwards, after the webinar. Next question for Fritz. You discussed the mixing of the IT network and the OT network. Who in the company is pushing those integrations, and how could something like the attack matrix help you discuss the risk with those stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, and it's an interesting question. So, so the first push, actually, I think there's a couple of movements in the last couple of years. So WannaCry and NotPetya for sure was a wake up, but actually I saw the push is coming more from the customer perspective, as the customer actually wants to collect more data and wants us to provide more data to them, give them more visibility on the line. The second push, what we're seeing, is regulatory requirements, like the FDA cybersecurity, as we do have a medical business unit. So we saw this mix of customer requirements and regulatory, or really like standards being used from customers, and those kind of things push this more. into this integration of like how you collect data, how you monitor that. And I think the third factor, what we saw this push of IT/OT environment is the efficiency, right? Is, hey, if you do this remotely, why can't I do this, manage this remotely more, right? So kind of let third party manage certain things on the ICS network and those conversion, right? So I think it's the three things. It was not an IT push. Maybe that's the question related. So IT didn't really push this converge. So it was really customer regulatory and efficiency requirements, right? Creating this kind of areas. And can you use the MITRE framework to discuss the risk to the stakeholders? Yes, but it's depending on the stakeholders. And think about that in a way that if I talk to my chief operating officer, I will not use the MITRE framework actually to go and explain that risk, right? That's where you need to understand the audience. However, what we see very successful actually is when we're using that is when you talk to test engineering, when you talk to really the deep down engineering folks, because they actually understand such a framework, and that's the right audience where you can explain them the risk and show them the risk, right? And then you can map what they are doing to the risk, to the MITRE attack framework and say, guys, hey, this is operational procedures, like simple things like using still very weak credentials, right? How easy it is actually to gain access with the lateral movements because you are not fully separated anymore, right? Those kind of things you can explain to test engineering. So it's really, you have to look into the stakeholders and how you communicate to the stakeholders. And I think that's very important.
Okay, thank you, Fritz. Next question says, hi, Otis. May I know where I can get more information on the emulation and gap assessment that you presented just now?
Sure. I don't know where to post the link in here, but if you go to attack.mitre.org, there is a tab for resources. Under there, there's a tab for getting started, and that talks about a lot of the use cases that I talked about. Maybe we can share that later. All
right, thank you. Let's see, next question for Otis. As you developed the ICS framework, what surprised you compared to the legacy enterprise framework?
Well, the enterprise framework is able to talk about platforms like Windows, Linux, Mac. It's very difficult in this area to get to that level of granularity and still make it applicable to all of the industrial control systems. So we kind of had to deal with, abstraction and being more abstract than the enterprise knowledge base. So instead of talking about platforms like Windows, we talk about assets like HMIs, historians, and different things like that. And we're really thinking about how the adversary affects a broad class of assets versus specific platforms. And that's just to deal with the sheer diversity in this area. So that was one thing that, we kind of had to deal with.
All right, thank you. Next question for Nadir Israel. What is your perspective on application security towards those ICS domain-specific applications?
Well, short answer is yes, do. But I think in general, it's tricky, right? Lots of these applications are old. Lots of them are proprietary to particular vendors. I think ultimately the same rules in this case apply as in the world of OT for the most part. It's just taking into consideration that most mitigations can't be used in the same fashion. Most of the endpoints are managed. Most of the applications are proprietary and usually can't manipulate anything. I think the MITRE attack framework actually covers quite a few things that intersect with application security. But best practices are still being adapted. And while absolutely this should be taken into consideration, I think following the particular techniques and following the particular things that were presented here is probably the best way of approaching this. Sorry if I didn't quite answer the full question, but feel free to reach out after.
All right. Question for Fritz. Have you seen attack attempts increase due to COVID?
I would say not in overall attacks, but I see the certain attack vectors being increasing. Like so, you saw the attackers change the way like homework, right? A lot of people working from home in our companies, right? We still have a lot of people in the factories, but so we have seen like phishing attempts, spear phishing attempts. It's a significant increase in certain attack vectors, but we haven't really seen an overall increase of attacks.
All right, thank you. Next question. It's not directed towards any specific person. It says, what's the best practice on MITRE ATT&CK? Is there any document or checklist? Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing applies to one of the last questions I asked, or that was asked. On the attack.mitre.org, we have a resources page. I would check that out to see if it can get you up to speed. It has general information, frequently asked questions, trainings and different things like that. I think that's the best resource.
Okay. Thank you. Next question. What type of certifications and/or degrees do you view as the best ones to prepare subject matter experts to work in your specialty areas? Maybe Fritz, maybe that's yours, since you're probably hiring more practitioners than anybody.
It's really depending. I mean, for forensic, for example, you can use, it's depending on the tools. We use NK, so we have a really deep down forensic analysis. Then I have for the incident responder, the SANS certificate or training and certification is really good. It's really depending on the areas, right? So you need to check out, it would be depending what subject matter expert you want to have, and then in what areas of security, application security, there's many things. I want to notice two things. I'm looking more for development or application security background is getting bigger, like in general developers, because there's a lot of movement into the cloud. So I'm looking also for like cloud experience, cloud security practitioners. Actually, I want to have for cloud security, cloud native trained people.
All right, thank you. We have time, I believe, for one more question. There are several that are still unanswered, but don't worry, we will get back to you after the webinar. This one is for Nadir. From your experience in both the traditional IT enterprise and ICS networks, what is the most significant difference in the techniques that you've seen by adversaries?
Well, first and foremost, the intent is what's important here. With IT, it's mostly about data. It's not so much about compromising the IT environment. It's about compromising or stealing the data. In the case of ICS networks, almost all the techniques and all the tactics are around disruption of operation. This might be for profit, it might be for other malicious intent, but understanding that difference is really understanding everything about how this works. If an IT environment, it's all about understanding command and control, understanding data exfiltration, being able to stop things at the perimeter. In the case of an ICS environment, it's really an understanding of how lateral movement works, understanding as soon as possible when programming changes or when operations change in that environment, and taking action as decisively and quickly as possible to prevent damage and to prevent financial loss. I think, hands down, that's probably the most significant difference in both the techniques that are mapped out as well as real-world cases. But there are obviously the second difference is really in the response. In most cases, an IT-type response would be to shut down networks, shut down devices, quarantine things. Lots of tool sets that exist for IT professionals that for OT aren't as applicable. You don't want to take down an OT environment, especially not the core devices that are there. So other mitigations and early detection and response are key to preventing damage.
And thank you, Nadir. We are now out of time. That wraps up today's session. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. For more practical tips about how to defend against attacks on ICS environments, visit armis.com/blog. And of course, if you'd like to schedule a live demonstration of ARMIS's agentless device security platform, you can sign up at armis.com/demo. Again, thank you for joining, and that concludes today's webinar. Bye-bye now.